What's up? CJ here. I just got started over at Sentry on the syntax team, and they sent me a MacBook that needs to be set up. So in this video, I'm going to do just that. And I've been using MacBooks for over 15 years at this point. And in that time, I've tweaked a lot of settings, I've tried a lot of different apps, and I've arrived at what I believe to be the most simple and minimal setup that allows me to get things done. So at the beginning of this video, I'm going to cover basic OS settings, apps I use every day, and that'll be useful for people that are new to a Mac or even just power users. And I am also a software developer, so I've been writing code for over 20 years, and I use a MacBook to do that. So in this video, I'm also going to cover all of my terminal and shell settings and configurations, and also how I set up VS Code and all of my preferred extensions. So whether you're brand new to a Mac, a beginner dev, a more advanced dev, just a power user, this video should have something for you. Be sure to check the description so you can skip ahead to a part that interests you, and without further ado, let's jump in. So the Mac that I got is a lightly used 2020 MacBook Pro. It has the M1 processor and 16 gigs of RAM. I just updated it to Sonoma 14.3.1, and most of what I'll show is still relevant to like Monterey and Ventura, but there are a couple of settings that are specific to Sonoma. And one of the first is what they've done to the desktop. So if you're on Sonoma and you click on the desktop, any windows you have open fly away and it reveals the desktop. Now, you might like this feature. I don't, so I'm going to disable it. So that's the first thing we'll do. If we open up System Settings, scroll down to Desktop and Dock, and there's this setting right here that says Click Wallpaper to reveal desktop. I'm going to turn this to only in Stage Manager. Now, one of the things I like on my computer is to keep my desktop completely clean. I don't save any files there. All I ever want to see is the wallpaper. And so they have this feature, Show Items on Desktop. I'm actually going to disable that, so now I'll never see anything on the desktop. In a second, I'll show you my Finder settings, and everything I save or download to my computer, I don't put it on the desktop. I put it in specific folders. So regardless of that, I still don't want to see anything on the desktop. So I'm going to uncheck those. And then also, I not only use Mac, I've also used Windows a lot in my life and also Linux, and they have released various types of widgets, and I never used those either. So widgets are new in Sonoma, but I don't plan on using them. So I'm going to disable widgets as well. Now, the next settings we'll update are for the dock. And one of the ways to be really efficient when using your computer is to use your keyboard as much as possible. And the dock makes you use your mouse. So to use the dock, you have to move your mouse down here, hover over the app you want to launch, and click on it. And that's not very efficient. We can do that purely with the keyboard. So if you press Command Space, that'll launch Spotlight. We're going to use an alternative to Spotlight. I'll show you in a second. But for now, we have Spotlight. And let's say I want to launch a Finder window. I can just search for Finder, and it instantly launches it. So using the keyboard will make you a lot quicker at navigating your machine. And that means the dock is just in the way. So one of the things I do is I completely disable the dock. Well, it's not disabled, but I get rid of all the apps that are on it. I make it as small as possible, and then I hide it, and ideally never look at it again because I'll use my keyboard for absolutely everything. So I'm going to go through, remove all these apps from the dock. I will then make it as tiny as possible, and then check automatically hide and show the dock, so that way it disappears, and then I never see it unless I actually need it. Now, under settings, I also like to put the dock to either the left or the right. It's up to you if you're going to do this, but I put mine on the left, and then I check automatically hide and show the dock. So now the dock is hidden unless I move my mouse over to the left, which I shouldn't need to do. I'm going to disable animating open applications. You can keep that enabled, but it also reduces the amount of work your computer has to do, and it like minimizes apps if you disable that. And then I'm also going to uncheck show suggested and recent apps in the dock, because otherwise Mac is going to start adding new icons to that dock, and I want to keep it as empty as possible. Next, we're going to customize Finder, which is the built-in app we use to manage our files and folders. So if you press Command Space, search for Finder, that will launch a Finder window. Now, if you press Command Comma, that will launch the Finder settings. And Command Comma is actually a very common shortcut. Inside of any Mac app, if you try pressing Command Comma, it very likely will launch the settings window. For Finder, I'm going to disable showing anything on the desktop, like we talked about earlier. And for new Finder windows, I'm going to set this to my home folder. Now, I actually don't use the recents feature on a Mac, which shows you like recently used or opened files. I specifically just want to see my home folder, because when I launch a Finder window, very often I'm just going to dial into where the things are that I'm looking for. So I set that to my home folder, and then I like to use tabbed browsing. So I'm going to check this option here. And now, if you press Command T, that will open up a new Finder window tab, and you'll see that it defaults to the home folder or whatever folder you specified. Now, if I open up Finder again, it's always going to default to my home folder. The other thing I like to do in my home folder is just show it as a list. Again, this is just a preference. But now, anytime I open a new tab, it's always going to show my home folder with the list display. Next up in Finder settings, I'm going to customize the sidebar. So if we press Command Comma to go back into the settings, Here under tags, I am just going to disable all of these. So I don't use the tags feature. Again, there's a lot of things in the OS that I don't actually use, but I don't use this, so I don't want to see it in the sidebar. I'm going to uncheck all of these. Now under sidebar, you can pick and choose what you want to see here. So this is totally up to you. You can choose what you want. Like I said, I don't use recents, so I'm actually just going to disable it and not show it in the favorites. Similarly, if there's folders that you don't go to often, just uncheck them here, because otherwise they're kind of like crowding up the sidebar. From there, I like to rearrange these icons. So things that I visit most often, I want at the top. So home folder, I want to be able to jump to that as quick as possible. So I move that to the top. From there, it's probably like downloads, then probably like pictures and movies. And then from there, it's kind of like up in the air. Maybe applications might go like right here. But again, order is up to you, but I like to order it in how frequent I access and use those things. Next, we're going to customize the advanced settings. So Command comma to bring those settings up again. Click on advanced, and I'm going to uncheck show warning before changing an extension. So if you're a beginner user, I probably wouldn't check this, but if you're more of a power user and you know what you're doing when it comes to file extensions, it can get annoying when you're trying to change file extensions. So I uncheck that. The other thing I do is I change the default search location. So by default, when you use the search feature of Finder, it's going to search your entire computer. But pretty often, I just want to search the folder that is currently selected or that I'm inside of. So I'm going to change this to search current folder. Next up, we're going to customize the Finder window. So I typically like to see exactly where I am on my computer, and by default, you don't see that. So let's say I dial into the downloads folder. You'll notice that it just says downloads. It doesn't give me any context for where I'm at. If you go to view and then say show path bar, that will show the full path of the current folder. And you can even click backwards. So I can go back to like the root of the drive where I can dial in. And so this gives me some context for where I'm at. The other thing I enable is the status bar. So if I go to view, show status bar, this shows me how many items are in the folder and also how much space I have left on my computer. So I can always see that at a glance. So that's it for OS settings and Finder settings. Let's jump into apps I use on a daily basis. So the first app I'm going to install is a replacement for Spotlight. Now, I used to use an app called Alfred, and I used that for years, but very recently I switched to an app called RayCast. And I'm still learning it, but so far it does everything I needed to do in Alfred, and there's a lot of cool extensions and plugins you can install as well. So to install it, I'm going to pull up Safari. We're going to search for RayCast, raycast.com, and then I'm going to download and install it. Now that it's installed, let's launch it. This will be one of the last times we use Spotlight, so command space, search for RayCast, launch the app. And now you can begin setup. Now, they're going to take you through a tutorial. I recommend if you're new to RayCast, definitely go through their steps in their tutorial to get used to how the app works. I'm just going to flow through this really quick, enable all of my settings, and then we'll move on from there. I will mention one thing is I'm actually going to disable window management. So I am really used to using a separate app for window management, which I'll show you next. And RayCast has that built in, but I haven't used it yet because I'm so used to the other app that I'll show you. So I'm going to disable window management for now. I also disable clipboard history just because I do a lot of screencasting and I don't want my recently copied passwords and stuff like that to be displayed. So I'm going to disable that. Everything else I'll leave is enabled, and then I'll just run through the setup. Now I want to replace Spotlight with RayCast. So I'm actually going to change the keyboard shortcut here to be Command Space. So if I press Command Space, it actually launches Spotlight. So I can't actually replace it just yet. To replace it, we're going to need to disable that keyboard shortcut for Spotlight. So if I press Command Space and search for keyboard, this will bring up keyboard settings, and then we can change the keyboard shortcut. So click on keyboard shortcuts, go down here to Spotlight, and then uncheck Show Spotlight Search for Command Space. This now disables Spotlight for that keyboard shortcut, but that means we can assign it to RayCast. So here in RayCast, I'm going to do Command Space, and now we've assigned that keyboard shortcut to RayCast. And so now anytime I press Command Space, it will launch RayCast instead. So now that we have RayCast installed and set up, whenever we press Command Space, that will launch RayCast. And it works very similar to Spotlight. So if I want to launch a Finder window, I can just search for Finder. But one of the cool things about RayCast is if you launch something, so let's say I just type the letter F. If I find our Finder, it's way down here, and I launch that, now that will move to the top of the list whenever I type F. So now it's almost as easy as Command Space F, and then I can launch Finder. So RayCast will kind of learn as you launch apps, and it'll remember what you typed in to launch those specific apps and keep track of that. So now it'll be much easier and quicker to launch the apps that you would like. Now RayCast has a ton of other features, and I encourage you to explore it. So when you open RayCast for the first time, you're going to see this start supercharging your productivity. If you launch that, that is basically just like a tutorial of all the things you can do in RayCast. So I definitely recommend going through that. I'm going to show you some useful things that I like to do. So there's a built-in calculator, so I can just do maths. What's nice is if I hit enter, now that result of the maths is on my clipboard, so I can use it somewhere. The other thing is you can instantly jump out to search engines. So I can, for instance, jump out to DuckDuckGo. Right now, I made it so that if I type D, like DuckDuckGo is one of the first results. So I can type D, tab, and then search for something, and that instantly launches whatever your default web browser is for that specific search term. So RayCast, super cool. There's so much more that you can do. And one of the first things we'll do is install an extension that's going to allow us to install other apps as well. Now, to install other applications, we're going to use a thing called Homebrew, which is also known as the missing package manager for macOS. So if you're used to like Linux and package managers on whatever distribution you're used to, this is very similar, but it's not built into the Mac, so we have to install it separately. Now, if you are someone who's non-technical and who's like never used a terminal before, use caution when some random stranger on the internet tells you to run a command in the terminal. You can trust me, though. And specifically, if you visit brew.sh, it's a well-known website. A lot of people use it. And there's a command here that we need to run to install Homebrew. So I'm saying even if you're non-technical, you can at least do this step, and then it'll make it really easy to install other apps after this. So to install Homebrew, we're going to copy this install command right here, and we're going to launch terminal. So terminal is built into the Mac, and it's a way of running system-level commands on our machine. And you don't have to be technical to be able to do this. You can actually just right here, Command V, and paste in that install command. For this part of the video, this is as technical as we're going to get. Later in the video, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I'm going to show you how I set up my terminal and customize it and everything else. So paste that command in, hit enter. It's going to ask for your password for sudo access. This is another thing. If random people on the internet are telling you to run commands on your machine and it's asking for sudo access, you better trust that person that's telling you to run those commands. In this case, Homebrew needs to modify the system files and actually create some folders on our machine. So we do have to give it our computer password. This is okay to do. If you don't trust me, ask a friend. But I'm going to type my password in here, and it's going to install Homebrew. Now, when you start typing your password, you're not going to see anything. But it is working. So if you hit enter, and if you typed your password correctly, you're going to get this prompt. You can hit enter again, and it will start installing Homebrew. The other thing that it's going to do is it will install the Xcode CLI tools. And so those are useful not only for Homebrew, but also if you're developing anything else on your app. If you're using Node.js or Rust or Python or Go, all of those ecosystems need a way to compile things natively on the Mac. And so they use the command line tools for Xcode. So this is going to install that and Homebrew. And then from there, we can start installing other applications. So this is going to take a little bit. In the meantime, I would suggest check out syntax.fm. Listen to some podcast episodes, and yeah, we'll be back when this is ready to go. All right, now that that is finished, you'll notice that it is asking us to run 2 more commands. So I'm going to copy this first one, Command C, Command V, run that command, and then copy this second one, Command C, Command V, and run that as well. This basically just makes it so that we can now use the brew command. So after running those 2 commands, if you type brew, you should see some output like this. And if you do, that means that Brew is set up and ready to go. Now that we have Brew installed, we can install a plugin inside of RayCast that allows us to install things via Brew. It's worth it, I promise. So one of the coolest things about RayCast is their really big plugin ecosystem. So they have plugins for all kinds of things. You can look at their site and store and kind of just see what plugins they have. Specifically, we're going to install the one for Brew. Now you can install it directly through the website, but you can also use RayCast. So if I pull up RayCast, press Command, to bring up the settings, click here on Add or Command In, and then choose Install from Store. This is going to let you search across the extension store. We're going to search for Brew, hit Enter here, and then hit Enter again to install that extension. Now that it's installed, we can launch it. So if you pull up RayCast and search for Brew, you want to choose Brew Search, and this is going to let us search across all of the available formulae and casks. Now, formulae are typically like CLI tools, and Cask are more like desktop applications, but we can install it all through here. The first app we're going to install is for window management. Now, I mentioned earlier that RayCast includes utilities for window management. I just am really used to an app called Rectangle. I have all of the keyboard shortcuts memorized, so that's what we're going to install. So if you pull up RayCast, search for Brew. Now we can search for the app we want to install. I specifically am going to search for Rectangle, and then I want the first option here. I'm going to hit enter again to install. Now that Rectangle is installed, you should see a little green check mark. If you don't, just try installing it again, and from there, press Escape twice. that'll take you back to the main RayCast menu, and you can launch it. So if I search for rectangle, that will launch it, and you'll now see a little icon in the menu bar up here. And if you click on it, you can see what your possible keyboard shortcuts are to manage the windows on your machine. So let's just launch a few windows. I'll grab Finder, let's grab Terminal, let's grab Safari. And now I can use these keyboard shortcuts to move things around. So for instance, Command Option Left will move a window to the left half. If you press it again, it'll do 2/3. If you press it again, it'll go back to 1/3. If you press Command Option Right, it'll be on the right side. Command Option Up takes it to the top. Command Option Down takes it to the bottom. Control Command Left takes top left corner. Control Command Right. Shift Control Command Left, bottom left. Shift Command. You get the idea. And I highly recommend memorizing all of these keyboard shortcuts because it's super useful to be able to navigate super quickly with your windows. So I can like grab that, make it left half. Command Option Center will center a window on your screen. So I basically know these keyboard shortcuts like the back of my hand. Is that a saying? Yeah, I know them really well. So I use them all the time, so I can very easily like navigate between windows and kind of like make my own layout of windows like so. So rectangle, highly recommend it. And like I said, memorize these keyboard shortcuts because you're going to be using them all the time. The next app we're going to install is for switching between running applications. And so by default on a Mac, when you press Command Tab, that'll switch your running application, but you'll notice that it only shows the icon of the window. I like to see like a full window preview before switching, and this app called Alt Tab will give us that. So we're going to install it using Brew. So Command Space to launch RayCast, do Brew search for Alt-Tab, and then hit enter and enter again to install it. Now, once Alt Tab starts up, you're going to need to give it accessibility and screen recording permissions. This is because it's actually taking screen caps of the windows so that it can show you them whenever you're switching between them. And by default, Option Tab will now show you the window previews. And you can leave it like that. So Command Tab is just the built-in one, and then Option Tab is Alt Tab, and you can see those full window previews. I like to completely replace Command Tab. So if we pull up the settings for Alt Tab under Controls, we can change this to be Command Tab. So just click right here, press Command, and now Command Tab has been taken over by Alt Tab, and that will be our default way of switching apps. I leave all of the default settings. You can kind of like dial in here to Alt Tab to figure out if you want to customize it any, but I like all of the default settings, and from there, I now have a nice and easy way to switch between apps and actually show the window previews when doing so. Next up is an app for all of your apps. So you'll notice as you start to install these Mac apps that are always running in the background, a lot of them will create these menu bar icons, and they're always up here. And if you get a lot of them, it can get really out of hand, and it's starting to, as you can see here in my menu bar. So we're going to install an app called Hidden Bar that lets you automatically hide things that you don't need to see all the time. So we'll launch RayCast, do a brew search for Hidden Bar, all one word, and then hit enter to install the app. Now that it is installed, we'll launch it. So search for Hidden Bar, and when it launches, you'll see this little icon here in your menu bar. And essentially there's a timeout, and after that timeout, it'll hide anything to the left of that vertical line. So what we're going to do is drag all of the icons we don't want to see all the time to the left of that line. So if you hold down Command and drag the icons you don't want to see, those will be automatically hidden. Now, after you've moved everything you don't want to see all the time, you can see that your menu bar is nice and clean. And anytime you want to access those other menu bar icons, you can always press this and then choose the one you want. And again, if there's something that you want access to all the time, just drag it to the right of that arrow and it will show up in the menu bar all of the time. So another app I like to use lets me see the stats of my laptop at a glance. So I always like to see the network traffic that is happening, how much free RAM I have, how much hard drive space I have, and I want to see all of that in the menu bar so I can like quickly glance at it. And this app is called Stats. So if we launch RayCast, do a brew search for Stats, there's a Cask here. It's called Stats, and the description is System Monitor for the menu bar. We're going to install this one. From here, we can launch it. So if we run Stats, so from here, Stats is going to ask for some permissions, and then we can start to configure which things we want to see at a glance in the menu bar. So with Stats installed and set up, now if you click the menu bar, hidden items, you can see that we have some stats running in here. And I'm going to go ahead and just drag all of these to the right of the arrow so that they don't automatically collapse. And then we can start to configure which ones we actually want to see and all of their settings inside of Stats. So now that I have all my widgets configured to my liking, I also will show you how I configure the battery icon. So by default, the battery icon just shows a graphic. It doesn't show the percentage. But here under battery settings, you can drag in the percentage. Now the percentage is just going to show up as a separate icon here. And that's not very useful because now you have two different things. But if you go into widgets and then merge widgets, now those two things are combined into one. And so when you click them, you're going to get your battery info. The other thing I like to do is I like to use the clock built into stats, because this actually lets me add multiple times. So if I turn this on and then drag this over, now I can see this clock here, and I'll show you how to disable the system clock in a second. But I like to see a 24-hour time. I like to see the seconds there, and you can change the format string. So in a second, I'm going to show you a different plugin for showing the date and calendar. But for now, I'm just going to remove the date. And so we just have the default time right there. Now, what's nice about this is you can add other time zones. And so when you click on the clock, you can instantly see other time zones. So I have coworkers in San Francisco and in New York, well, Eastern time zone. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add UTC -5 and UTC -8. Now, by default, you can see all of the time zones in your menu bar. I don't want that. You might, but I don't. So in the settings here, you can actually uncheck the ones that you don't want to see all the time. And now they'll be hidden, but when you click on the time, it'll actually show the other time zones as well. So to disable the built-in time, now that we have this time widget from stats, open up system settings, and from there, just search for clock. And down here under Control Center, there's some options. Display the time with seconds in the menu bar. If you click on that, that's going to give us the rest of the settings that we need. So here under Show Date, I'm going to say Never. I am going to disable AM, PM, and I'm going to change it to an analog clock. So this is kind of the best we can do for now. Just change it to an analog clock. That way, this is kind of like our default clock here. And next up, I'll show you an extension that gives you a nice little calendar in the menu bar. This next app is called itsycal, and it runs in the menu bar as well. So it's going to display the current date, and we're going to put that right next to our time widget. So if you open up RayCast, do a brew search for itsycal. Let's install that. And from there, we can launch it. You'll see by default, it just has this icon here, but you can jump into settings and customize it. So I like to launch it at login, and then under appearance, I like the outline look. I'm going to show the month and the day of the week. Also, we can specify a date time pattern. So if you don't like the default, like Tuesday, February 27th, you can click here, and that will show you some format options if you want to change how the date and day of the week are displayed. That's pretty much it for itsycal. I like to just have a nice little calendar at a glance. So yeah, next I'm going to install an app that reminds me to take breaks. Now, micro breaks are tiny little breaks you can take to prevent repetitive strain injuries. That's issues like with your wrists and your tendons. And basically every 10 minutes, you take a 10 to 20 second break to take your hands off the keyboard, take your hands off the mouse to prevent those repetitive strain injuries. And so an app I use for this is called Time Out. So if we search Brew for time-out, we can install it. Now I have Time Out set up for a 10-minute break every hour and a 10-second micro break every 10 minutes. So it's going to pop up once every 10 minutes for 10 seconds and once every hour for 10 minutes. You can give it permissions so that way it can detect if you're actually using your computer or not, and then intelligently pause or start the timer, the break timer, and you're good to go from there. So you'll see that it's running here in the menu bar, and it shows us how much time until our next micro break. Now, there are a lot more settings that you can specify in here, and timeout is free to use, but there are some features that you can get if you decide to support the developers. I use the free version. I have supported them before, but the free version works completely fine. So when a break kicks in, it looks like this. Basically, it just takes over the screen and reminds you, in this case, to take your hands off the keyboard if it's a micro break. If it's a longer break, I don't know, go get some coffee, walk away from your computer. But I have this running all the time, and it's extremely important because I am working on my computer all day, every day, and I have to be reminded to take breaks, and so this app is great for that. Next up, I'm going to install my preferred web browser, which is Firefox Developer Edition. Now, we could talk for hours why that's my favorite, and you probably have your own favorite too, but I'm going to set it up and I'm going to show you all the extensions that I use. So if we search for Firefox inside of Homebrew, the only option we have is the default Mozilla Firefox web browser. I want to install the Developer Edition, so I'm going to have to tap a specific Cask to get access to that. There's this Cask called Homebrew Cask Versions, and if you tap it, that will now give you more options to install things. So this also has like beta versions, canary versions of a lot of other types of software. And once we tap this, we'll have access to it inside of Homebrew. So I'm going to copy this tap command and open up my terminal, run this command. And from here, we'll have access to install extra things that aren't listed by default inside of Homebrew. Now that we've tapped the Cask, we have access to other versions of Firefox, but for some reason, we don't get access here inside of Brew, inside of RayCast. I would recommend if you're not super technical, just go with the basic Mozilla Firefox or search for Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome or Brave or Opera or any browser you prefer. You should be able to find it here in the brew search. But because I want to install a non-standard version, I'm going to have to do that through the terminal. So here in the terminal, if I do brew search Firefox, this is the same kind of search that's happening in the RayCast UI, but it's happening in the terminal now. And we can see these extra options that I have. So I specifically want this developer edition. So I'm going to copy that and then do brew install that. So now I'm going to configure my preferred settings inside of Firefox, and then I'll show you some extensions that I like to use. Now, the extensions, a lot of them are available for other web browsers as well. So if you don't care about my settings in Firefox, you can just skip ahead to the extensions that I show you. So to modify our settings, press Command, comma. That'll take us here. First setting, open previous windows and tabs. I always want to see the same windows and tabs that were open the last time I was in Firefox. I'm going to make Firefox my default web browser. And then I am going to check, always ask where to save files. So every time you download a file, if you don't check this, it's just going to automatically put it in downloads. And I like to keep things nice and organized. So you check that box. Now, every time you download a file, you have to make a decision about where it will live on your computer. Next up in Home, I like to disable all of the built-in settings. So I don't want to see any of those recommended stories or shortcuts or web search. And for now, we're just going to set it to be a blank page. And now when I open a new tab, it's nice and clean. There's not any extra stuff. The other thing is I actually disable the bookmarks toolbar here. So if I go under View and then Toolbars, Bookmarks toolbar, Never Show, now we get a nice and clean new tab page. Next up under Search, I like to set DuckDuckGo as my default search engine. So I'm going to change that to DuckDuckGo. And I actually like to disable search engine suggestions. So if you start searching the web for a thing, in a way, this is kind of like a keylogger. It's literally sending every keystroke to their API to get back some search suggestions. And I don't like that. Basically, whenever I start typing, I only want to see websites that I've visited before or things that I've searched for before. I don't want it to make an API request to try and suggest what to search for. So I'm going to disable that. And you can see by default, it's still going to suggest my browsing history, my bookmarks, any other tabs that I have open, those kinds of things. Now, I'm also going to disable these suggestions. And then down here, I'm going to remove all of the search engines except for DuckDuckGo. One of the nice things about DuckDuckGo is they have Bing shortcuts. So if I do, for instance, want to search like Wikipedia, let's say, I can do !W, do the thing, and it will jump over to Wikipedia. You can even jump to Google from DuckDuckGo if you want to, !G, and followed by your search term, and that will actually jump you out to Google. So I like to keep DuckDuckGo as my default search engine, and then I can jump around to other search engines if I would like to. Next, under privacy and security, I'm going to leave all the enhanced tracking protection as is, but I actually don't use the password manager inside of Firefox. I use 1Password, so I don't want Firefox to try to save the passwords itself. So I'm going to disable all of those settings. So also, because I present a lot and I'm showing my screen, I do not like the save and fill payment methods. I don't want it to accidentally suggest things when I'm presenting my screen for other people. And along those lines, if I go into these history settings, I'm going to disable search and form history. And so that way, if I ever type into any input box on a website, Firefox doesn't memorize that. So it's not like suggesting things when I'm presenting my screen for people to see. I'll also disable all of the data collection. So that's it for settings. Next up, I'm going to install some extensions. And the first one I like is called Tab Bliss. And so this is an extension that is our new tab page. So once we install it, it will automatically show the time and a greeting and a random image if you'd like, once you have it enabled. So we're going to install it. And then you'll see when I open a new tab, now we see Tab Bliss. And I can keep changes here because I want Tab Bliss to run in every new tab. Under settings, you can change the background source. I like to leave it on Unsplash. It's a nice random image that changes. And you can change the frequency of how often you see a new image. You can also set it to like a solid background color and then change whether or not you see the time. It's very customizable, but this is nice and zen. So when I open a new tab, there's not a bunch of distracting stuff. The next extension that's really useful is called One Tab. So are you the kind of person that has 100 tabs open and you don't want to close them because you know somewhere in there there's something you don't want to forget? One Tab is for you. So once you install it, let's say you have a bunch of tabs open. Let me just open a bunch of tabs. Okay, let's say I have all these tabs open. And and I don't want to lose them, one tab is awesome. So just click one tab and it will instantly take all of the tabs you had open and throw them into this page. And now if you want to open that thing back up, you can just click on it and it actually removes it from the list. Also, if you had a bunch of links open that you want to share with someone, you can click share as web page, and this will generate a unique URL with all of those links inside of it. So this is super useful, especially if you do like a lot of research and you constantly have hundreds of tabs open. This lets you keep track of those without having to actually close all of them. Another extension I use all the time is Dark Reader. So you'll notice that Wikipedia is kind of blinding right now because it doesn't have a dark theme. And so Dark Reader is really nice because it will automatically show a dark theme on websites that don't have one. So once we add it, we can choose which websites it will appear on. And so by default, if you go into the Dark Reader settings, it's going to be on a not inverted list, meaning it's kind of enabled for all sites by default. I like to choose inverted list only, and that makes it so that as I browse the web, I can pick and choose which websites Dark Reader will kick in on. And so if I wanted to kick in on Wikipedia, now that I have it on inverted list only, I can click on Wikipedia, and now any page I visit on Wikipedia is going to use that dark theme. And so I have like a running list of sites I have it enabled for, like HTMX, hint, hint. there's no dark theme for HTMX, though I've thought about PRing one. I just haven't yet. But like HTMX doesn't have a dark theme, so I go and enable Dark Reader for it, and now I have a nice dark theme when I'm on the HTMX website. So yeah, Dark Reader is awesome. It will save your eyes for sure. Next up are some extensions for Firefox that help maintain my privacy when I am browsing the web. The first is uBlock Origin, and this is the best ad blocker out there. So you may or may not use an ad blocker. I like to use one because it makes the web usable in a lot of places where it's not. So yeah, uBlock Origin is awesome. The next one is called Privacy Badger. And this is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and it automatically blocks tracking scripts. Now, Firefox actually has some built-in ways of blocking tracking scripts, but Privacy Badger is really nice because like if you click a link in an email and it's potentially a tracking link, Privacy Badger will kick in first and be like, hey, are you sure you want to go there because this is detected as a tracking link? It'll also prevent certain tracking scripts from loading on websites. You can always like enable it or disable it if it breaks certain websites, but yeah, Privacy Badger is awesome. And then the last one is an extension called Decentralize. And basically all this does is it caches libraries that are loaded from a CDN. So CDNs are actually a way for companies to track you around the web, because if two different websites load the same library from that CDN, now the CDN actually knows that you visited those two websites. But Decentralize is nice because it kind of just runs in the background here. Anytime a request to a CDN is made, it will cache that, and then subsequent requests get served from the cache. So it's not always pinging the CDN server, kind of revealing what websites you're visiting. From here, I like to customize the Firefox layout. So this is a newer feature in Firefox, this recent tab here. I don't really use it, so I'm actually just going to remove it. You may get some use out of it, but I don't use it. So I remove that. And then I like to arrange things here in the bar. So if I right click and go to customize, there's this flex space here that I really don't even know what it's for, but it typically just takes up a lot of space. So I pull those off. I also don't use the pocket button. And then from here, I can add icons. So I want to see one tab and Dark Reader all the time because I want those within reach. So I'm going to right click those and do pin. And then same thing for Dark Reader. Now, if we go back into customize, we can kind of arrange these in the order that we like. Now, I like to keep uBlock Origin and Privacy Badger visible because sometimes websites will break because of the ad blocker or the tracker blocking. So I like to keep these enabled so that I can very quickly and easily go up and turn them on or off if it breaks a certain website. Now, from here, there are a bunch of other apps I use as well, but I'm not going to dial into every single one of them, but I will show you a list, and I'll show you how to quickly install a bunch of apps using Brew. So if you pull up the terminal, and then we're going to edit a file. So I'm going to create a file here called apps.txt, and then on each line, I'm going to put the name of a Brew Cask that I want to install. So beforehand, you're going to need to search and find the names of all the Brew Casks you want to install, and then throw them into this file. Now, I'll give you a quick rundown. I use Slack and Discord for messaging, Figma for editing images, Spotify to listen to music. I use an Android phone, so Android Platform Tools gives me the ADB debugger. Android File Transfer lets me transfer files from my phone. I use VLC for watching videos. Keka is a replacement for the archive tool, so it lets me unzip and unarchive 7-zip files and RAR files. Cap lets me quickly and easily create screen recordings. Keycaster will show the keys pressed on the screen whenever I'm presenting. iterm 2 is the terminal that we're going to set up and customize next. Visual Studio Code is what I use to code, and we're going to set that up after iterm. And then Sublime Text I just use as a quick and easy text editor. So save this file by pressing Control X, press Y to save. And now we want to run brew install for every line in that file. And for that, we're going to use xargs. So if I type xargs brew install, and then left arrow apps.txt, now it's going to run brew install for every single line in that file, so I don't have to manually install all of those things. After this is done installing, I'll have iterm 2, and we're going to jump into configuring my shell and settings and everything inside of iterm 2. I forgot about Docker. Let's see if brew has Docker. That's a lot of options. So I am going to search brew.sh for Docker. Now there are two things listed. There's Docker, the Docker formula, and the Docker Cask. We want the Cask because I specifically want Docker desktop. So if we do brew install -- Cask Docker, I think it should pick the Cask version. Yeah, there we go. And it's going to install Docker desktop. Next up, I am going to configure iterm, which is my preferred terminal emulator. Now, you can use the built-in terminal on a Mac. I like iterm for a variety of reasons, which I'll show you as we configure it. So I installed it with brew, but now we can launch it and get into it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bump up the font size because I'm a nice presenter. I like you to be able to see what I'm doing here. We're going to dive back into these settings in a little bit, but first of all, I just want you to be able to see what I'm doing. Okay. So from here, I'm actually going to set up Oh My Zish. This has nothing to do with iterm. It's just a nicer way of using Zish that has a bunch of built-in settings and plugins and things like that. So Zish is the actual shell that we're using here. If you type echo $, shell, that will tell you what your current shell is set to. Now, macOS a few versions ago switched to Zish being the default shell. Bash is another shell. I used to use Bash. I used to switch the Mac from Zish to Bash, but these days I'm just going to stick with Zish, and we're going to use a thing called Oh My Zish. So if we pull up Firefox and search the web for Oh My Zish, we can visit Oh My Zish. Now, because Zish is my shell, my current shell, I should be good to go to just run this command. If you see a different output from shell, like if you see bin bash, then you don't want to use Oh My Zish. Instead, you potentially want to change your shell to Zish, or if you want to keep using bash, there's another thing called Oh My Bash. And this works very similar to Oh My Zish, but it's specifically for bash. So if you're using bash, you can use this one. I'm going to stick with Zish. So I'm going to copy this command and then run it in my terminal here. And now we're good to go. And instantly you can see a nice little upgrade here. We can see that it has some fun little colors. And actually, if I start to type a command, so earlier we were doing things like brew install. So if I type brew and then press the up arrow key, you'll see that it actually searches through my history. And that is enabled by default when you install Oh My Zish. Now, obviously, you could enable that setting yourself with just standalone Zish, but there's a lot of nice default settings that Oh My Zish enables that makes working in the terminal really nice. The other thing is themes. Now, I'm going to just leave the default theme, which I believe is Robbie Russell. But if you take a look at the Zish RC, which is in your home directory, that will show you all of the settings that have been set up for Zish. Now you can see here the Zish theme is Robbie Russell. If you want to dial into other themes, you can check out that page and change the value here, mess around with the different themes. I'm just going to leave it to Robbie Russell. I like it nice and simple. And there is our micro break timer. Just in time. So if you've been watching the video this long, it's probably time for you to take your hands off the keyboard, the mouse, maybe stand up for a second before we dive into specifically our iterm settings. So Command comma will bring up the iterm preferences, and we're going to go into appearance, and I'm going to choose the minimal theme. Now I like this because it gets rid of the way the bar looks at the top. Now it's nice and integrated. Now we're going to jump into the default profile and specify all of our terminal settings. Now, one of the things you should do, even if you don't set any of these other settings, is go into keys, key mappings, and then choose natural text editing. And the reason we want that is because by default, let's say I have a long command like this. A universal shortcut is to press Option and the arrow keys to like jump over words, or like Command left, Command right. You'll notice that by default, those keys don't actually work here in iterm. So in our settings, I want to set this to natural text editing. and we'll just remove all of the pre-existing key maps. And now I can use Option to jump over or Command to jump to the beginning and the end. So that's a tiny little feature that's actually super useful. So make sure that you enable that. From there, I'm going to check reuse previous sessions directory. So if I am in a specific folder, let's say I'm in downloads, if I open up, well, we're gonna have to allow it first, but if I open up another tab, I want that tab to use the same folder that I was in the previous tab that I had open. So that setting is key. Next, under colors, I'm gonna set the foreground color to be all green. So no red, all green, no blue. And so this gives us like this lime color. I just like a really high contrast between the text foreground and background. So I like to set the foreground to lime green. Next, I like to change the default font to be a font called Anonymous Pro. So Anonymous Pro isn't built into a Mac. You're going to need to install it, but let's go grab it. So I grab it here from marksimonson.com. I'm just going to download and install it. All right, now that we've installed the font, I should be able to select it. I'll be honest, I actually had to restart my machine because it wasn't even showing up, but now we have Anonymous Pro. So I'm going to set that as my default font. That looks great. I'm actually even going to bump up the default font size here to 32. Obviously, you're probably not going to do this, but again, I present my code and my machine a lot, so I like the font size to be nice and readable. So that's it for my settings inside of iterm. Next up, I am going to configure my zshrc to give me a few more aliases and kind of customize how the terminal works. But I have some things to do, so I will catch you tomorrow. It'll be the same video, but I'll probably be wearing something different to do the rest of the setup, so I'll see you then. New day, new beanie. So to configure Oh My Zish, you can check out their wiki. They have all you need to know about the various settings you can enable or disable, and then the various plugins that you can enable. For me, I have a repo on GitHub with my preferred settings. So if you go to github.com/w3cj/dotfiles, you can take a look at them. There's this .zshrc file, and this is the file that you want to modify in your home directory to enable your settings and plugins. So if you look at mine, it's fairly simple. I just kind of have the default setup, default theme. I do enable case sensitivity. So this is if it is auto-completing a command I'm typing in, it takes into account the case that I've already typed. I also have correction enabled. So if I make a typo, it will suggest a correction to that command. And then I only have the Git plugin enabled. And so this will show you what branch you're on in any given repo and also gives you some aliases. Now, there are a bunch of other plugins that I've just never really looked into, but you can enable those here as well. And then I also have my default editor set to Nano because I don't use VI or Vim. And then I have a bunch of custom aliases. These are just shortcuts to various commands that I run pretty often. Now, the Git plugin includes aliases, but these are just some custom aliases that are slightly different than the built-in ones. Now, I need to bring this zshrc down locally to my machine, and I could just copy-paste it, but I actually want to clone the repo and link to the file so that it stays up to date with all of my preferences. But you can just go in and modify your zshrc. You don't have to do what I'm about to do. But in order to get these .files onto my machine, I need to set up my GitHub SSH key and also all of my Git settings. So that's what I'm going to do in the next section of the video. So next, we need to set up our SSH keys, and this is going to allow us to clone and push to repos that we have write access to on GitHub. So there's an article that you can follow that has all of these steps I'm about to do. But first, we need to generate that key using your email that you have set on GitHub. So I'm going to open up iterm, run this command with my GitHub email, save it to the default location, enter in a passphrase, and you're good to go. Next, we need to enable the SSH agent. So that's running. Next, we need to update our SSH config. So this will auto-load the key that we generated and also make it so that whenever you type in your password, it saves it to macOS keychain, so you don't have to type in your password every time. So because this is a brand new Mac, this SSH config file does not exist, so I'm just going to edit it with nano. So I'm going to do nano and then the file path. And then inside of there, I'm going to put this here. Now, because I saved it in the default location, this is exactly what I need. But if you change that location or change the file name in this previous step, then you will need to update the config. So I'm just going to paste this in, and then Control X and Y will save that file. Next, we'll add it to the keychain. So I'll just run this command. Now we need to add this key to GitHub. So I'll just pull up their docs for that. They're going to give us all the commands we need to run. First thing is we need to copy our public key. So pbcopy is a command built into a Mac, and it's actually going to take the contents of that public key file and copy it to the clipboard. So we'll run that command. Now it's copied. Now we need to go into our GitHub settings and actually paste that key in. So from here, you'll give it a name. You just want to identify like what computer this belongs to. I'm just going to mention that this is my MacBook Pro 1st Century, and then Command V will paste that public key that got copied. Now, it's okay for me to show this because this is my public key. However, you do not want to show the actual contents of this file here. That is your private key, and if someone had that information, they could push to your GitHub repos that you have write access to. So we'll add this SSH key, and then we should be good to go. Next, I'm going to clone down my .files repo. Now, I want to make sure that we're on the SSH tab here, so it uses the key that we just set up. And I'm going to clone this folder into my home folder. So I'll do a git clone. And then now I'll go into that folder, and I need to run a script that I have in there. So I have this config script, which will automatically copy all the .files in here into my home directory. So we'll do that. So if I cd into my home directory now, and then just do an ls with hidden files, I should see my git config, my default git ignore, and then my newly updated zish rc. So from here, I should be good to go. Now we can make sure this worked just by opening up a new tab. So if I open up a new tab and zish still looks all right, then that means at least our zish rc is set up correctly. And we can also take a look at what git is configured to. So if I do a git config global user.name, as long as I see the setting that I specified in my git config, we know that that is working as well. There are a couple of terminal commands that I use frequently, so I'm going to install those with brew. I'm going to put the name of all of them inside of a text file, and from there we can just run the install command on all of them. The first one is ffmpeg. I use this to convert videos, to chop out sections of videos. There's also image magic. This lets you convert image types from the command line. Also, wget and telnet are not built into a Mac, so I'm going to install those. And then tldr is a super useful tool that gives you common examples of how to use many different CLI tools. So I'm going to put all of these in this file, and then from here I can run xargs, brew install, and then pull in that file. And this is going to run brew install for every line in that file. Now I'm going to install Node.js. So Node.js is a runtime for running JavaScript on the backend. I use this for most of my backend apps, and you can install it directly from brew. But I actually like to use a tool called NVM, or Node Version Manager, and this lets me have multiple versions of Node on my machine that I can switch to depending on what project I'm in. So if you go to the NVM GitHub repo, they have an install script that you can copy. So I'm just going to run this command here, and this will install NVM. Now, after the install, you'll notice that it automatically updates your zishrc or your bash profile or whatever shell you're using to automatically use NVM for any new terminal session that you start up. So if I open up a new tab and type NVM, if we see some output, that means that I now have NVM. And I want to install the latest LTS version of Node, which right now is version 20. So with NVM, I can type NVM install 20, and that will automatically grab the latest minor version and install it. From here, if I do node-v, we should see that we're running version 20. And now I'm going to install a couple of global commands from npm that I use frequently. So I'm going to do an npm install -g. One of those is a tool called Light Server. This is an auto-refreshing, just static file server. There's also HTTP server. This is not auto-refreshing, but it's just a really quick and easy way to start up an HTTP server. I also use this command called license, which automatically generates open source licenses in my repos. And also I use a command called git config, and this auto generates git configs based on the project type that you pass in. So I'm going to install these globally so I have access to all of these tools whenever I'm working on various projects. All right, we're good to go. It looks like npm actually needs to be updated here, so I'm just going to go ahead and run the command that it tells me to run. So npm install -g npm, that should give me the latest version of npm. Awesome. So from this point, I'm good to go. I've got Node on my machine. I've got all my commonly used CLI commands. Now I'm going to set up Visual Studio Code, which is my preferred editor. Now, I've used a lot of editors, and also there are a lot of editor options. So if you don't like VS Code, then just skip this part of the video. But it is my preferred editor, and I'm going to show you how I set it up. Now, I already installed it with Brew, which you can do as well. You can also download it from their site. Now, I have a repo that lists all of my settings, extensions, and everything else on how I set up VS Code, so I'll link that down in the description. One of the first things is as I set the font to Anonymous Pro, which you saw me set up earlier when I was setting up the terminal. So I already have that font installed. And then for the theme, I like this theme called Just Black. It's a very high contrast theme with a very dark background, so I really like that. and then have a bunch of extensions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install all of these extensions, load in all of my settings, and then kind of walk you through what I think are some of the more interesting parts of my setup that you might like. Now, to install all of these extensions in one go, I'm going to copy them and then run a command, which is going to install the extension for VS Code. Now, I would highly recommend that you craft your own list of extensions. These are things that I use because it's the specific type of development that I'm doing. You may not be doing that kind of development. So I would look through these extensions, see which ones are useful to you, and then kind of craft your own list of things that you want to install. So to install these, I'm going to open up iterm, and I'm going to create a text file that has the name of all of these extensions inside of it. So we're going to create a thing called vs extensions.txt. I'm going to paste that in here, Control X, and then Y to save the file. Now I want to run code -- install extension for every line in the file. So I'm going to do a little command line foo. First, I'm going to cat that file. Then I'm going to pipe that into the xargs command. I'll tell it to run one line at a time. And for each line, we're going to do code -- install extension. So it's going to run this for every line in the file and install all of my preferred extensions. Now that those are installed, I'm going to create a directory on my computer where I put all of my code projects. So I like to put it in my home directory, and I like to make a directory called dev, which is short for development. Now, you can call this whatever you want. So some people call it projects, some people call it workspace. I like dev, it's nice and short. But basically, this is one of the ways that I stay organized. Every single project I create or every repo I clone, I put it inside of this folder. So let's go in there, and then I'm going to create a directory where we're going to do some work to kind of show off VS Code. So I'm going to create a directory called my first website, and then cd into there. Now I'm going to press code period, and that's going to open up code inside of this directory, and then we can load in our settings and start working on some files. Now this is what VS Code will look like on first launch, but I want to plug my settings in, which will set my theme and everything else so it can start to look like how I prefer. Now I'm going to copy the settings JSON that I have right here and just load all of that in. I would highly recommend that you don't do this because these are my preferred settings, and you should probably pick and choose the ones that you want to get your preferred editor experience. And I'm going to talk about some of the main ones so you can decide if you want to enable or change those settings as we go. So I'm going to copy this. Then inside of Visual Studio Code, press Command-Shift-P and search for Open User Settings JSON. So by default, this will be a completely empty file. I am going to paste my settings in, press Save, and then boom, all of my settings kick in, including my theme and layout and everything else, and we can go from there. Now you'll notice by default, my setup is very minimal. It's almost like Zen mode, where I'm not showing a bunch of extra stuff because I really want to just focus on the code that I'm writing. So let's take a look at my settings JSON file, and I'm going to kind of point to the settings that create this layout. The first setting here is disabling the status bar visibility. So when the status bar is enabled, it looks like this. It's down here at the bottom. There's a bunch of extra info that I don't really want to see all of the time, so that's why I disable it. Now, you can toggle it on whenever you need it, but I don't want to see it all of the time. Next up, I put the sidebar on the right-hand side. So if you press Command B, that will open and close the sidebar, and I like mine on the right. So just to show you why, let me create a new file. So Command N for a new file. I'm going to save it so I can get some syntax highlighting, and then I'll just do a little console log here. But now, when I toggle that sidebar, my code doesn't shift to the right. So if your sidebar is on the left, every time you open and close it, your code just shifts. So that's one of the main reasons I like it on the right-hand side. Now, I've been using it this way for a few months now, and I like it. So far, I haven't run into any issues. So yeah, I definitely prefer it on the right. Next up, you'll notice that my tab bar is not visible. But if you press Control-Tab, that will show you all of your open files. So that's why I don't have it visible. So right here, I have Editor Show Tabs None. That way, it's not taking up a bunch of extra space in the vertical as well. And if I need to switch to a file, I'll just press Control-Tab and then pick the file that I want. The next really useful setting is snippet suggestions, and I have that set to top. So if I'm in a JavaScript file, and for instance, I want to do a console log, I can just type log and then tab, and that inserts the console log snippet. And you'll notice that that snippet option is right at the top of that suggestions list. But if we disable this, now, if you go to do a snippet expansion, it's not at the top. And so you have to like arrow down to get to it. So that's a really useful setting. So that way you don't have to arrow down to get to those snippets that you're using very often. Another setting I have is I disable the minimap. So the minimap is this here that kind of like shows you your code overview at a glance. I don't find it very useful. Every now and then I might need it if I'm in like a really big file, but by default I disable it so it's not taking up any extra space. Now, another useful setting is linked editing, and you'll see this in an HTML file. So let me create one really quick. And let's say we have a tag. So I'm going to create a little h1 that says hello world like this. Now, notice as I navigate around, whenever my cursor is on an opening tag, the closing tag also highlights. So that's one key benefit. Another thing is if I start to edit the opening tag, the closing tag automatically updates. So that's super useful, especially like, if you're renaming tags or kind of like moving things around. And it's just built into VS Code. So you don't need an extra extension for this. You can just set this to true. Next up, I'm going to run through some of my most used extensions here in VS Code. Now, I use a lot of extensions. If you visit this Git repo, you can see the full list. I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that I use most often. And the first one is font size shortcuts. So I present my code a lot, and I want to be able to increase and decrease the size of my font without increasing and decreasing the size of the editor. So by default in VS Code, if you don't have this extension, whenever you press Command plus or Command minus, it zooms in and out the entire user interface. And a lot of times you don't want that because then it'll just like make your sidebar really huge. So with this extension, now whenever your code is highlighted, the Command plus and Command minus shortcuts only affect your code. Next up is VS Code icons. This just makes it so you have nice and pretty icons here in the sidebar. So there's cool like JS icons, HTML5 icons, and really any other type of file that you create, it has a nice little icon that it displays there. Next up is prettier. Now, if I'm working in an established project, it probably already has a prettier RC, but sometimes I'm working on just like one-off files and I want to be able to format them. So the prettier extension is great for that. So for instance, this project doesn't have a prettier RC, but I can press Option Shift F and that will just run prettier on this file. So this is really great if you paste some JSON data and you need to format it, or some XML data or something like that. Another extension I really like is Code Spell Checker. So this is great if you make a lot of typos like me, and if you have a misspelling, right inside of your editor, you can press Command period, and that will bring up all of the suggestions to fix it. So super useful. Another good extension to grab is this Post CSS, IntelliSense, and highlighting. Now, there are several of these, and you might be thinking, well, it's just a CSS extension. Make sure you get this one. The other ones are broken for me. This is the only one that seems to work and actually give good autocomplete and suggestions inside of CSS. This next extension is a must if you work with TypeScript, and it's called Pretty TypeScript Errors. So if you're in a TypeScript file and you come across some type error, usually it's just a whole lot to parse and a whole lot to figure out. But Pretty TypeScript Errors makes it much more readable and kind of allows you to pinpoint the exact error more easily. So once we enable this extension, now when I hover over, you'll notice that instead of just this blob of text, we have a nice, readable, and also syntax highlighted error message that gives me a much better idea of how to fix this type error. This next extension is for making HTTP requests inside of VS Code. Now, you might be used to using a separate tool like Insomnia or Postman, but it's really nice to have this built right in the sidebar here. So I can press Command-Shift-R, that opens up Thunder Client, and then I can create new requests. You can also see your history of requests. So if I click on these, then that'll automatically load up the body and the headers or anything else that I had set. It's right there in my history. And it works just like those other tools. So you can send these requests, you can change the HTTP method, all that good stuff. And then another extension that works really well in conjunction with this, especially if you're in a TypeScript project, is paste JSON as code. So let's say I made this API request, which gives me back some Pokemon data, and I want to create a TypeScript type from this data. I can just copy that data, and then over here in my TypeScript codes, we can generate a type. So if you press Command-Shift-P, search for paste JSON as code, give it a top-level name. In this case, it's a Pokemon. This will then generate a TypeScript type using that JSON data. So this is super useful, especially if you're just like using fetch in your codes and you want to get some good type completion. You can generate the type and then just import it in. That's it for the extensions I use the most. The rest of these extensions are specific to languages and frameworks. So depending on what you do in your day-to-day job, you may or may not get some use out of these. But XML tools is really great if you work with XML and you need to format it, or if you're working like with configuration files that are XML. Tailwind is essential. Their extension is if you work with Tailwind daily. It gives you really good editor support. You can hover over the Tailwind classes and it'll show you exactly the CSS that's being applied. Also, if you're working in React, there is an extension that gives you a bunch of snippets. And depending on the type of styling solution you're using in your React projects, there are a set of extensions that will give you much better editor support. If you're working in Vue, Volar is the way to go. There's the Svelte extension if you're working in Svelte or SvelteKit. The Prisma extension is great for giving you auto formatting, syntax highlighting, and autocomplete. And then the HTMX extension is great to also give you some autocomplete on those HTMX tabs. So these are all these extensions. If you have any suggestions for things that I missed and that I might like to use, definitely let us know down in the comments. And if you found any use out of the ones that I mentioned, let us know as well. That's it for this setup video. Hopefully you found something interesting or useful by watching me set up my machine. And if you're brand new to a Mac, hopefully you got up and going. If you have any issues, let us know down in the comments. I'll be sure to try and help you out. Also, every single thing I talked about, every app, every setting, every command I ran, is going to be in a Git repo that I'm going to link in the description. Also, I'll link every single app and everything in the description as well. So if I missed anything, let me know in the comments. I'll definitely get you a link to the stuff that I talked about. Now, I realize that my setup is very unique to me, and maybe it's not for you, and that's completely fine. If you know of anything or you saw anything that maybe I could be doing better, I'd love to know about that. And also, if you saw anything that is useful and that you're going to incorporate into your own setup, I'd love to know as well. So just keep in touch. I want to know, how you doing? How did this work out for you? Was it useful? Was it not? So yeah, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.